So Ableton Live 12 just dropped last week and there are a ton of awesome new features. Today I want to share 68 of those with you, from the bigger ones you may already know a little bit about to the lesser known features that I really had to dig deep into the Ableton release notes to find out about. There's a ton of goodness here, and so make sure you watch to the end of the video to get the most out of your update to Ableton Live 12. And with that, let's hop straight into it. So when you first install Ableton Live 12, there's an awesome project by a guy I've known actually for years, Chuck Sutton, makes incredible sort of futuristic hip hop music. And there's some great sounds and uses of the default Ableton tools that are included in Ableton 12 in this project. So encourage you, just have a bit of a listen.
What I need couldn't get here faster.
Such a sick track, right? Now, the first thing you'll notice in comparison to Ableton Live 11 is the dark theme by default and the slightly reduced contrast. Things are a little more muted looking in Ableton Live 11. 12 rather. Now, if you go into your preferences here, you can actually change the grid line intensity, for example, to make them more kind of what they looked like on Ableton 11. Completely up to you. I had it on 60, which I believe is the default for 12. You can also change things like the brightness and whatnot if you prefer a different look. And of course, you can always go back to the classic medium light or medium dark. I'm going to switch this back to the default for now. And the second thing I really like about Ableton Live 12, going back to the project, this is not really a feature, I guess, but there's so many cool like effects and sounds in this default project from Chuck Sutton. So like, I don't know what the copyright is on these, but like some of these effects, man, like if we just solo this strum, there's like these dissipate. Like you can actually just look at what's going on in these racks, see what is being modulated, like the dry wet of the chorus there and this hybrid reverb. You can just like go ahead and save these racks as something you want. Cool rack. And then you've got those default racks from this project. Go through the drums ones. There's so many cool ones, even this like Angry Bees thing. Some really sick stuff to play with. Okay, I've just loaded up a new project here, and the third thing I want to show you is the show similar samples feature. Now, you may or may not have seen this, but it is absolutely sick. I'm going to demonstrate this with our EDM starter kit. Now, if you do want some good free samples, no matter what DAW you use, if it's Ableton, I will leave a link for our free EDM starter kit down in the description. Got some great sounds in it that you can use in a lot of different genres of electronic music. Let's take this clap, for example. Now, say we really wanted to use a clap like this in the track. Well, you'll notice this new squiggle line here, which you can actually click. This is actually going to filter all of the sounds in your Ableton user library and find sounds that it has analyzed to be similar. When you first load up Ableton 12, you will notice it takes a bit of time to analyze all of your sample library. It will do that, maybe takes half an hour for really big sample libraries, but once you've done it, here's the original sample. Here's all the other ones after it. So it's analyzed these samples to be the most similar. Now, speaking of drum racks, if you see that this icon that we saw here earlier in the browser is also on the top of the drum rack, you can actually swap all the samples to something similar. So I'm just going to play this drum loop here in my project, a little bit of a raw trance sort of thing going on. If I press this, and then I press this next arrow, takes a second. And then I can listen to that in context, right? And then I can go back. So before and after. And then next. It basically does that sample selection process for all the drum pads in a drum rack. So cool. I'm going to go back to my original for now, which is really cool. Now, you can also lock individual pads if you want the samples to remain the same. So, for example, if I locked everything except the kick, only the kick drum would change, which is actually something I would probably do in the case of this track here. Now, if we load up something in a simpler, this is the fifth trick I wanted to show you, like that's sort of the snare we looked at before. You can then also come down to the little corner here where you got these arrows and swap to the next similar sample. So if I wanted to play this just on my MIDI keyboard, I don't even have to move out of the simpler to do it. I can just do it here. So cool. So the number 6 tip I wanted to share with you is the new window toggle. So you'll see this little icon in the top left up here. This is the browser toggle, bit of a different user interface here. We can click this to hide and show it. But of course, the coolest part of this is also the device view and the clip view. Down the bottom, we have these new toggles down here, which allow us to easily visually get to what we want to see without having to click on an audio clip or a MIDI clip or the actual channel. Now, the other awesome thing is you can stack these together. So now we can see both the MIDI clip and the device view at the same time. So cool. That's my number 7 favorite tip. Number 8 is one you probably have heard about, but it's the mixer view inside the arrangement view, which is so cool, right? So I can actually see all my mixer channels. Now, one thing you'll notice, number 9, is that the mixer channels have these colorations down the bottom, which is just a nice little visual touch, but also look at the meters. There's a lot more coloration to the meters and the frame rate is much higher. So a lot better for just seeing what's going on in your mix. So you don't have to kind of guess how close to the red am I. And I love those little drop downs at the end going through all the colors. Now, one of the biggest things, if we come back to the browser, is the content filters at the top. I can filter by all sorts of different things. Like, so I can sample by loop or one shot. I can sample by the type of sound it is. You know, you'll have to do this for your own samples, which is a bit time consuming. It would be cool if it automatically detected that. Doesn't quite do it yet. You can also add new types of filters here with the add groups, which is super, super cool. The other cool thing as well, I'll just quickly mention it, is that the filter is different between each browser pane. So you'll notice in the samples 2023 folder, there's only 2 filter types that I've got viewing here. I can hide them individually and show them as well, which is pretty cool. And that way, every time I come back to a certain browser pane, it will have a different set of filters that are showing or hiding. Now, number 16 is the global scale mode. You'll see this next to the metronome up here. Basically, if you enable this, it will enable global scale mode across all devices, which I'll get to in a second, because a lot of the MIDI devices, for example, now have this feature. I could go in here, or maybe actually let's do A major, just so it's a bit different. Let's go to my MIDI clips. Let's say my FM bass lead here. And I can see that down here in the bottom left, the global scale is on, which is good because then what it's going to do, it changes it here when I change it up here. So this locks all instruments, all MIDI racks, all scale highlighting to the global key, which is fantastic for workflow. And number 18, if we go to the MIDI effects, you'll see there's a new arpeggiated layout, which is finally something I've been wanting for ages because the old one was kind of limiting in some ways. You'll see you get a visual here, which I really like, right? I can add my steps and all the normal controls. I still haven't added the 3/16ths and stuff like that, which I really would like, unfortunately. But you can't have everything you want, right? Still very helpful and much more visual. You got all the same sort of controls over here. You got velocity changes. In addition to that, there's a new chord device. I'm going to put this on the bass just because why not, even though we probably wouldn't use chord devices. Now, the cool thing with this new chord device is you can use the current scale that's locked to our global key up here. So in this case, C major. But you can also detect an incoming MIDI chord, right? So if I press learn, I'm going to play a C major 7. There, it's just put shift 1, shift 2, and shift 3 in there, across from the fundamental, which is C in this case. Now we've also in the modulators section, which is now, I believe, separated out, we've got the LFO device, which is just way better and way more easy to use. For example, I'm just going to map this over to, let's say, the warmth knob, which is awesome. I'm going to chuck on our normal MIDI here. The cool thing is now you can actually move the knobs while the LFO is modulating it, which you couldn't do before. Speaking of modulators, the new Shaper has a one-shot mode. So if we load that up, you can actually go from just loop. So this is basically going to treat it like a one-off one-shot, right? Now, in order for this to enable, you have to press the trigger. So let's map this to the feedback again. So every time I hit that trigger knob, it basically triggers the shaper. For example, if I change the shape. There's a slight update to the new multiband dynamics plugin. You might not have noticed it. If I add on our multiband compression preset here, you'll notice that the different views for the below, above, and attack and release are now all there by default. So you don't have to click any knobs. Now I have to talk about the new Meld synth, which you may or may not have heard about. Absolutely fantastic, multi sort of generative synth. So there's a lot of different synthesis engines. I encourage you to go and explore some of these cool presets. For example, that's more of a rack, which is pretty cool. Eliza Beethan Gloom, why not? Which is really, really cool. You can see all the different generative engines there, whether it's basic shapes, kind of like how Serum works. These two knobs do change between each of the different engines, which is really cool. And of course, you get two of those. Standard amps are between A and B, so amp envelopes, modulation settings, and whatnot. There's LFOs as well, different for each A and B. Really, really cool. You can link them here between the two with this link knob, which is helpful for getting a more unified sound. A few settings for each of these engines. I've never seen a synth where the oscillator A and B have such different controls. Pretty much the whole signal chain. Like you can change the oscillator key tracking on both oscillators, the filter on both oscillators, the portamento pore oscillators. I've never seen that before. Another really cool one, which you have to download as a third-party Max for Live device, is the new Granulator 3. So if I just drag this onto a new track down here and load that up, I'm just going to pop in a new sample, ideally something with a bit of melody. Now, a lot of the controls are the same. You do have these three modes now, the classic, loop, and cloud mode. I encourage you to play with all of these, but I absolutely love cloud mode because it just sounds so dreamy and random. Oof. You do have this time all of your kind of envelopes and stuff like that are a bit more visual as opposed to the old way where it was a bit more just kind of knob based. So I love the extra visual feedback on these. You still have those two views. The last thing we really have to talk about is the new raw device. I've used raw on this little bass stab up here. Let me just take off this EQ to really show you. I'm just going to enable one as well so we can really just hear one going on this bass sound. So it's got this capability to be a multi-band saturator or compressor, but even just in single mode, it's a really powerful wave shaping distortion unit. You've got the main drive and tone controls, which are going to affect the general sound of the distortion. It kind of reminds me of Scream and Reason, if anyone's used Reason. The shaper type is going to be very important in determining how this actually sounds. For example, if I change this to noise injection, sounds a lot fuzzier. If I bring up the filter, this is one of my favorite ones because it just adds like that erosion-y type noise without being over the top. And there's a few other controls, for example, how the feedback works. You can control the amount of feedback here, which is going to feed the signal back into the distortion unit itself. Very cool. Now back to the LFO. One thing you can do in Ableton Live 12, if you grab an LFO and say you want to modulate this frequency here, pretty wild modulation. We can decrease the depth. But what if I wanted to grab a second, say, LFO and change some settings? So we maybe have like a stray waveform here, which is kind of this random siny sort of thing. But I can map this to the rate, or I could map it to, say, the depth. So now we have a modulator modulating a modulator in a sense, which is really, really cool for these multiple layers of modulation. Super fun. Now, one thing I love about the new MIDI clips is that if you kind of go here to the clip view, you click envelopes at the top, which is this new layout. You can actually see your modulation clips here. You can show all of your envelopes, which is pretty cool. But if you go to, and we copy over this clip to, and I'm going to go over to clip view here. Let's paste it in the bass clip here. You can actually see any modulators, but you can also see any automation you've added. So if I've added, say, some modulation on this ratio here, automation, should I say, if I now go back to session view and double click, you can actually see that there's the automation clips will show in the actual clip, which is super sick. I don't think that's been there before. Now, unfortunately, this doesn't work in arrangement view, which I really wish it did, because then I'd be able to see the automation at that point in the clip's life cycle. But because the clip may be used in a loop mode, it probably doesn't make sense that it works. Anyway, you got the ability to see both the automation and the modulation for a certain parameter. So if we had automation and modulation on the compressor ratio, you can switch between those there. One lesser known thing about Ableton Live 12 is that this overview is now part of the full arrangement window. This used to be a separate thing. You can still use it to zoom in and out on different parts of the arrangement, but it is all in one window, so just good to know. Now, one of my favorite features is if you go into your settings here, I believe it's display and input. You can actually select this, use tab key to navigate. This will disable the tab key as an ability to switch between the arrangement and session view. But you'll see here, if I press tab on my keyboard, it cycles through all the controls on a given part. So it'll go from the on knob to the solo knob to the arm knob, the fader. And so if you're in like a synth or something like that, you just got the frequency selected, you can actually just cycle through those controls as well. You've also got shift tab if you want to go backwards. Then if you have alt tab, you can press alt tab and it will, like, for example, if I got the on switch, it'll go to the next channel with the same control. So I can go to alt tab next for the perk loop, alt tab for the top loop, alt tab for the ride loop, and it will go to the on off switch for that. Now, if you go and enable the MIDI keyboard, again, you can press M to do so. Of course, a lot of the normal things, for example, switching on automation mode and pressing A on my keyboard now will not work. If you want to enable that though, simply press Shift A and now it will work. Now, if you want to freeze a track, now there's a shortcut. If you right click, you'll see it's Shift Alt Command F. Now it freezes it, which is really cool. Speaking of freezing, you can now right click and freeze and flatten in one step. So if you want to not bother with the freeze step, just do that. Unfortunately, there's no shortcut for that, but it is a feature there if you right click. So if you're in a MIDI clip, you can use Command F9 through F12 to set start points and loop points. Now, if you do Command F10, you can change the loop brace start point, and Command F11, you will be able to set the end point of the loop brace, and then you can, of course, just loop that section of the MIDI clip if you want to. If you're playing through a clip and you kind of want to just change, where's my track going to play from? If you press Shift Command Space, you'll see that blue marker moves there. So I'll play ahead again, Shift Command Space, 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 space. It will follow the playhead. Pretty cool if you just need to quickly change where your track is going to play from. If you're at the end of a clip with your insert marker, you press enter and you go left or right, it will start to move the end of that clip, which can be helpful for arrangement purposes if you're trying to lengthen out something, loop it up, etc. Another sick feature is if you want to say do any sort of keyboard shortcuts. For example, maybe I want to see the automation for a second, but I don't want to commit to enabling that feature. If I press and hold, say A, now if I hold it down and let it go, it will latch on and off. So again, if I don't want to have to commit to like this, I've just pressed A as normal, I can just latch and hold. This also applies for soloing. So if I could solo a track, this applies for zooming in. It applies to the function keys. O now enables the metronome while you're playing. Helpful. So number 40, if you use screen readers, if you've got vision impairment or you need accessibility features, it's something that's now compatible in Ableton Live 12. I can't demonstrate that right now, but I would definitely go and Google about it. It's definitely working a lot better than it ever has. So this is a small little thing, but very helpful if you like to work in drum racks. If you, for example, like to set up a send in your drum racks or in whatever device, if you go to sends and returns, you can enable this down here. You can now swap these around. You never used to be able to, but it's a little thing that makes a big difference for work. You can now see the sample rate up in the top right here along with the CPU. Again, you have to go into your preferences a lot of the time to actually change this. Depending on the audio devices, some won't allow changing the sample rate, but it's just an easy, quick way to access those settings. You've also got this ability to see the waveform zoom. So if I go here, and you'll see the audio waveforms change across the whole project. Quite helpful if you prefer a more less zoomed in waveform or a more zoomed in waveform. And if you, for example, have it dialed in and you want to turn it off, you can always just turn that off there, which is pretty helpful. Now you'll notice in the mixer / arrangement view mixer, there's none of the send returns, delay, track delay features enabled here. You have to go down to the drop down and enable it here, which is a little bit frustrating. Keep latency shows up in the mixer version here. If you hide that, one thing that's frustrating is that it doesn't seem, and I don't know how I've got it to show this in the past, but it doesn't seem to always show the full view of what I want to see in the arrangement. So if anyone in the comments is clever and knows how to set that up so it's not enabled only when the mixer is enabled, please let me know. Another cool thing, if we go down to the device view here, I'm just going to disable the mixer for a second. If you look at the meters between all of the devices, you'll see that these meters are taller and higher quality, the same as the mixer meters we have there. So a lot nicer to see what's going on between the devices. So if you've got any projects in your browser, for example, one that you're working on, if I load this project up and expand it, you should now see that the sends and returns now show up, as well as the master channel processing will show up. And then you could actually drag that into your track. So there's now browser history as well, which you'll see up in the top left here, these arrows. Now you can also access this with command square brackets. So I can go back in history or forward in history as well, which is really cool. So if I wanted to go back to, say, a different part of the browser I was just in, I can just use the command square brackets, all these arrows to do so. Very helpful. One cool thing is you can reverse whole MIDI clips now just from the arrangement view. You don't have to actually go into the MIDI and click reverse. So if I just press R on my keyboard, boom. And I love doing this on drums because you can just get those little pieces of variation. So one great thing I love about Ableton 12 is the new MIDI editor layout. It's just fantastic. It's a lot cleaner looking. There's a lot more flexibility with all these controls. Now, if I go into any sort of melodic MIDI clip and I have a bunch of notes just kind of scattered around the place, there is this cool fit to scale knob down here in the clip. It's just going to move all those notes onto the scale. So let's dive into some more of these MIDI editor features, starting with Humanize. Humanize is great. If you select the notes in a MIDI clip, and I've just got a little piano going on here, I'm just going to highlight the MIDI editor preview. Sounds good. If we humanize this, it'll just kind of add a 10% or whatever percent offset in time here. So I'm just going to click this a few times to kind of randomize them around. Go crazy. I like to go really large amounts for this sometimes. That sounds great. You can also set the length of the notes that are selected either to the grid size or a specific interval. So in this case, if I wanted to shorten them to the grid size, I can just set it there. Now, one cool thing, if we're wanting to add harmonic intervals to our MIDI, even more. Now, what the cool thing is about this interval creator, I guess, is that it's always going to stick to the scale. So it's not going to be a non-diatonic. As you can see, it adjusts the relationship of these notes so that they are always in the key. I absolutely love this. I don't believe you can turn it off if you wanted to, but that's okay by me because I don't really mind. And now, so if you look at these stretch settings here, this is a new sort of way to lengthen out the selection of MIDI notes. This is great if you're just wanting to take rhythms and sort of mess them around. Now, the transform settings here are absolutely sick if you're wanting to kind of transform the MIDI into something just completely random. Let's go to stretch back to where we had it. I'm just going to quickly reel a few of these off. I love the arpeggiate one. So if you click transform here, so we could change it, for example, to a random. We could do a faster gate. Let's go through some of these other ones. Ornament. Let's just kind of select all these, add some grace notes. You can kind of just get these little rhythmic intervals, adjust the velocity of them, recombine. So it kind of makes multiple notes come back together. You can adjust the velocity, pitch, and length. Strum is probably my favorite for creating like guitar strum and sort of glissando-y piano stuff. So go check out the transform controls as well. You've also got generate controls here. There's a few main sort of controls. There's rhythm, seed, shape, and stacks. I'm just going to go through each of these now really quickly. Rhythm just kind of generates a new rhythm, one note, right? You can choose the pitch of that note. This is really good, particularly for, there's like a rogue note up here. This is good, particularly for drums, of course. You can change this amount of steps, the pattern, what the step duration is, how dense they are, whether it's full or not. So much fun there. You got seed as well, which will change, basically makes a melody for you. Sometimes it's a bit too random, so you kind of need to just be careful with how many voices there are and also the pitch kind of range. Shape as well allows you to kind of create like a drawn MIDI pattern, like so crazy. Between two pitches here you can specify. You can choose a bunch of shapes by default. Change the rate. I definitely think that's necessary. Oof. And then lastly, you got stacks, which is good for chords. Change these different patterns by scrolling up and down. You can add another one there. So then this is the second chord, third chord with a different pattern. A few last features with the note editor, we can zoom in here. You can now Command J or right click and consolidate notes. You can split notes with E, Command E. If you have a fully long note and you press E and click, we'll kind of split it wherever you want. So if you then press Option E, click and drag, it'll then create different rhythmic intervals, which is super duper sick. You can then also select a bunch of notes, Command G them. Now you might be asking, why the heck would I want to group notes? Well, you can go down to this chance lane by enabling it down here in the bottom left of the MIDI editor. This diamond will now show the chance of that note actually playing. So if you're playing around with probability and that sort of thing, grouping notes like this might mean that only one of those notes out of that group will play. And there's only a 75% chance of that happening. So that's when that can be quite helpful. You can change that between play all or play one when that chance comes around, which is good. For example, if you've got a chord that you have grouped together, and for example, every time you want it to maybe play one of those notes, but not all of them. And those are 68 of my favorite Ableton Live 12 tips. I hope you got something that you weren't expecting out of this video. Again, if you want some great quality, free sounds and samples and presets for Ableton or whatever DAW you're using, check out our EDM starter kit down below. Go check out this next video on some other Ableton tips. Bit of an old one, but a good one to take your learning even further. Thanks for watching, and until next time, guys, happy producing.